I wouldn't put a shell that's manufactured in North Korea into a gun and be standing anywhere near it when someone pulls the cord. So Ukraine was as corrupt as Russia is. So the person that's briefed him tends to then take up a window cleaning job and fall out of it for a window.
So how's he going to pay the debt back?
Yeah.
Well, he can pay part of it back by giving away the resources you talked about earlier.
A very, very warm welcome to this week's Red Matrix podcast. Our special guest today, Philip Ingram, former colonel from British military intelligence. You and I have crossed paths lots of times in this space. A very warm welcome to you.
We have. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
We'll get straight in. One of the things I remember you talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, famously at sort of 3 to 10 day, and we're now at 850 days, I think, in. I remember listening to you talk about sort of 400s, then 500s. When's it all going to end?
Yes, my catchphrase was, this is day, well, we're 854, I think, today, day 854 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation. The sad thing is he was planning for it to be relatively short. 10 days, I've plucked that out of the air, a phrase. But I think, unfortunately, the way it is going, we're going to be talking about this in at least another 2 years' time. And that's probably being hopeful that it'll be close to an end in 2 years' time.
Isn't the worry, though, that, because I don't disagree with that, but isn't the worry that Russia is a bigger country, it has spun up its defence industrial base 3 times the size, it is getting weapons from North Korea, it is getting weapons from Iran. Surely the longer this goes on, the more bleak it looks for Ukraine.
Putin wants it to go on. The more bleak it looks for the West, potentially, if Putin can cause Ukraine fatigue. And this is difficult with all of the political changes that are going on this year, especially. And that's what he's hoping for. He has spun his defence industrial base up. He has fixed and brought in almost the same number of tanks and APCs and pieces of equipment that he has lost. But a lot of those are refurbished rather than being newly manufactured that have come out. And he talks up a good talk about how his defence industrial base is meeting the requirements and everything else. But when you start to drill beneath the surface of that, he's having to go cap in hand to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He's having to go cap in hand to the Iranians for more sophisticated capability. And he's doing as much as he can to tout China to supply some of the more sophisticated components that he needs to build this. He's suffering. And I wouldn't put a shell that's manufactured in North Korea into a gun and be standing anywhere near it when someone pulls the cord. And unfortunately, he's finding that with the lack of reliability. So this is one of the things about the whole conflict. There's a lot of talk coming out, and he's making himself sound very strong. The reality is he's nowhere near as strong militarily, and I think, therefore, politically, as the message that's coming out of Moscow
So
says.
what's your take on, there's a lot of talk about what his objectives are, were, and have they changed? Yeah. If it is still a special military operation, if it is still just focused on the Donbass land bridge and Crimea, or do you think he still harbours the ambition to subjugate the whole of Ukraine? And if that is an ambition, that probably is a several years away from being achieved.
It might be closer than we think, depending on the tactics he uses. His original aim was to turn Ukraine, I believe, into a puppet state like Belarus. He didn't want there to be heavy fighting. The military engagement was to topple the Zelensky government and to be in a position to put a puppet government in and create this Belarus-like buffer, gain access to all of the natural resources that come from Ukraine. It's one of the world's largest suppliers of grain and oil and foodstuffs. It's got massive natural resources. It's got huge sources of nuclear power and everything else. So it would help the Russian economy. And, of course, keep access to the Black Sea Fleet through Sevastopol in Crimea and keep Russia's favourite holiday destination under Russian control. And that's what he wanted to do. He didn't expect it to turn into a fight. So whenever he failed to topple the Zelensky government, and effectively his operation into Kyiv failed, and he was pushed out of the north of Ukraine, he strategically failed. He failed in his original objectives.
But
He's reframed those.
Yeah, but one of the reasons I was going down this path is I've heard you chat before about 2014, and that actually that was virtually without a shot being fired.
Yeah.
And actually, the implications were he probably gained confidence that he could go into Ukraine with that fight. And there's also a lot of talk that even after the start of the war, that there were talks about potentially trying to bring the conflict to an end. There was talk about Boris Johnson. There was talk about all sorts. What's your take on all of that?
It's how long have we got? I think the things that stimulated Putin into going in February. Two and a half years ago for his reinvasion were the success that he had in Crimea, virtually not firing a shot, and the lack of reaction from the international community. The fact that there was a political hiatus going on in Europe with Brexit, and he saw that focusing European countries and the UK on trying to solve a huge political problem. We've seen him try and influence that in the information sphere. The fact that we were kicked out of Afghanistan and the West was kicked out, and politically getting involved in a conflict had been extremely embarrassing, and we were licking our wounds. And remember, the UK Operation Pitting had just happened to extract lots of people out of Kabul with an international force going in as well, which was highly embarrassing. And he saw all of that as an opportunity for him to do where he'd been gesturing beforehand, and posturing to threaten Ukraine. But he saw Zelensky coming in at the same time, and one of the ways he managed to keep a degree of control over Ukraine beforehand was through the wider criminal networks, the oligarch networks. Ukraine was as corrupt as Russia is, but the oligarchs in Ukraine were closely linked to the oligarchs in Russia because the business interests were there and everything else. Most of the cyber gangs were either based in Ukraine or based in Russia, and they're all linked. He then saw Zelensky coming in, and Zelensky with his anti-corruption ticket, an unknown figure because he wasn't a politician, who couldn't be influenced. And Putin was going, I'm concerned I'm going to lose the element of control I've got over where Ukraine's going from a criminal perspective, business perspective, and therefore political perspective. The West is focused on other things. They're licking the wounds after Afghanistan. Politically, Europe is focused on Brexit and everything else. They're not going to do anything. And therefore, I'm going to come in and topple the Zelensky government before he can get his feet under the table. And in the early days, Zelensky wasn't popular. Ukrainian media was still painting him as the comedian. That was an opportunity for Putin to exploit. He misread everything, I think.
If you're sitting in the West, you're in America, you're in the UK, whatever, and Crimea is about to go, and you've got a choice, which is to leave it or actually get involved. And then later, when he goes for Ukraine or a part of it, you do get involved. What was the difference from a Western point of view as to why not Crimea? I mean, that was the first incursion.
Yeah.
If you're going to do, if your mood is to do something to stop Russia doing that, then that's the time to do it. Why didn't they do it then and did it the second time?
That's a $6 trillion question. I don't think we've got the right answer for that at the moment. I don't think we've got all the right information to be able to make an answer on it. If I was to an assessment in, I almost said guess, but if I was to put an assessment in, I'd say because we didn't have the wherewithal, we didn't have the capability, we didn't have the political capital to allow our governments to make a decision to do something on Crimea, and we didn't have the military wherewithal to go and be able to influence what was going on. And therefore, it's that classic, right, what do? We'll stick our head in the sand and hope it's gone away and see if we can negotiate something. And this is where the Minsk I, Minsk II agreements started to come out, and tried to then find a way of reincorporating certainly the eastern part of Ukraine where Russia had created two independent republics, completely falsely. Those were FSB creations, and get those on a plan to integrate back into Ukraine again with, I suspect there was probably a political plan to try and then come up with some form of shared ownership over Crimea. But all of that's buried because of what's happened whenever Putin reinvaded in 22.
It's interesting because, picking up Bern's point, I do wonder whether or not history will be kind to the West about 2014. But I do remember at the time, as a student of military history, you look at the port of Sevastopol, the importance to Russia, how it found itself into Ukrainian hands. When it was more of a county of the former Soviet Union, and therefore, from a Russian perspective, hundreds of thousands of lives been lost. It's a jewel in the crown. It's the only warm water port. Whether the West sort of recognised that and went, this isn't our fight, I just think it's enormously easy to forget some of that historical.
Oh, very much so. It was only 1953 that the USSR ceded Crimea to Ukraine, by way of reward for the loyalty that they were showing to the USSR and everything else. And during that time, Ukraine was hosting Soviet nuclear weapons and everything else. It's Russia's favorite holiday place. It's Russian speaking. A lot of the population are ethnic Russians that are going through, even before 2014. The port was the Russian Black Sea. Sevastopol was the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters. There had been that joint agreement in place and everything else, and therefore I think the West looked at it and went, "Ooh, this is all too difficult," and it did the ostrich.
So, as a former intelligence officer, I know I've heard you talk about this before, but I'm really intrigued about how, therefore, Putin could get his intelligence so wrong in 2022, because we remember the 40-mile convoys, reports that they'd had all of their best uniform packed, that there was a bit of a fight at the airport, but it would all be over in a matter of days. Yeah. With the benefit of hindsight, that seems gloriously naive. How do you explain how Putin made such a miscalculation?
It's interesting. And we see the cause of that, not just in Russia, but we've seen it in the West. We look at Afghanistan and we look at Iraq. And right up until the Taliban came into Kabul, Western generals were telling each of their secretaries of state for defense that we have done a fantastic job here. The Afghan security forces and their military are up to standard. We've given them lots of kit. Their police are good in counterterrorism. Oh, the Taliban have come in. And that's because there's almost this no bad news to the boss angle that comes in. Everything is spun in a positive way. Get into dictatorship like Putin has in Russia, and we see the consequences whenever he gets briefed things that he doesn't like. So the person that's briefed him tends to then take up a window cleaning job and fall out of it for a window, or decides to have a heart attack next weekend, or falls off the back of his speedboat. And therefore, there's not this great appetite to give him the truth. And understanding Russian military capability, they had the paper capability. We got our assessments of their capability completely wrong. We overestimated the strength that they had because we underestimated the impact that corruption across the Russian defense industry had on the availability of their pieces of equipment, on their supplies of ammunition, on their training and everything else. And whenever Putin was shown a display of military capability, it was choreographed. So 3 tanks at minute 1.25 will go over the hump, and they will each fire around, and the target will explode. Well, whether those shells hit the target or not, something exploded in the target, and 4 aircraft will come in and do that. But it was scripted. It didn't bring in the complexities of war. If you look at the plan that the Russians had in place, it was a very good plan for coming in, and would have worked if they had the military capability to back it up, and that they'd got the Ukrainians by surprise. That's the first mistake. British intelligence or Western intelligence was supporting Ukraine and had pre-warned them as to what was building up and what was going to happen. And therefore the Ukrainians were more prepared than the Russians believed they were. The second piece that came in was the Russians. If you look at what they were trying to do, they had the FSB leading inside Kyiv, running around trying to find where Zelensky was, and members of government to capture them, hold them, wait for the troops to come in and secure and get him out of the place. They couldn't find him. Why couldn't they find him? He'd been pre-warned. He'd moved elsewhere, so he wasn't where they expected him to be. And Ukrainian security forces managed to take out a lot of the FSB 4x4s that were driving around Kyiv. That just suddenly popped up and then they disappeared. And they'll have been backed by the GRU. The air-landed operation that was due to go into the Homestill airfield was fantastic. Classic air-landed operation. Get in, secure an airfield, bring in more troops through transport aircraft, and they're bringing in their elite, their parachute forces, and then hold that, expand the bridgehead, and wait until the land convoy catches up and links up, and then you've got it. So if they'd got Zelensky or some of the senior government and they'd managed to hold the airfield, then they would have probably have toppled the government and would have had strategic success. But they didn't get Zelensky. Some of the helicopters were shot down. There were defences already at Homstil airfield waiting for them to come in. And the fight wasn't just Ukrainian regional forces that were defending it. There were lots of other good troops defending it. And then the air-landed forces that were coming in, the parachute forces that were coming in, 2 of the transport aircraft were shot down. They probably lost 2 battalions of extremely highly trained, their best troops, but that being shot down. So they'd no way of securing that bridgehead. And then they'd miscalculated what was going on the roads, because the ground on either side of the road is very boggy. You can't manoeuvre off it, so they were stuck to the road. The Ukrainians set up little mobile ambush units using British-supplied NLAW missiles and US-supplied javelins, and they took the head of the convoy out, knowing full well that the Russians couldn't get the recovery vehicles down to push the equipment off the side of the road. They couldn't maneuver around it, so they were stuck. They cut the tail off, knowing they couldn't reverse and get back, and then they just sniped away at the middle, and that's what caused the issue. And that caused Putin then to suddenly sit down and go, "We're not going to be able to deal with this." But his generals didn't want to brief him that in the first stages, and that's why that will have gone on longer than it needed. Maybe if they'd pivoted and tried something else at that time, they could have regained the initiative, but they didn't expect that to happen, and they'd no, in military planning terms, branch or sequel plan. And the branch is you come across a brick wall, and instead of punching at the brick wall all the time, you've got another plan which you've looked at and gone, that's a brick wall, let's find another way around it.
Do you think there was any implications of this? Because they don't have the sort of levels of delegated command. We have put a lot of faith in our junior NCOs, non-commissioned officers, our corporals, our sergeants and the like, to give them a lot of mission command, get out there and then think on their feet. It doesn't appear that they were able to do that, and that seems a pretty major shortcoming of the Russian military. It
is, and that's one of the big faults. Russian military, you say to a Russian commander, you go from A to B, and they'll drive from A to B, and when they get to B, they'll stop and wait for new orders. They won't get to B and suddenly go, actually, no, I've been sent to B to go and do this, and therefore, even if I haven't got orders, I'll start to set the conditions to go and do that. They'll stop and wait. And we've seen that in numerous operations that the Russians have done across the whole of the front line. And that they don't have an NCO cadre. They have a very hierarchical command structure. And this is where, in the tactical operations, then, whenever everything moved to the east, the Ukrainians could have good effect because they're in a unique position. A lot of their staff officers and a lot of their planners have been trained in the Russian staff colleges, and they understand the Russian tactics and the old Soviet tactics and everything else. But we've been training them in the West. And I remember the first Ukrainian staff officer come through the Advanced Command and Staff College, which was at Bracknell at the time, just down the road from where we are today, in 1996. And he was a Ukrainian Air Force officer. And how did I know that? Because he sat beside me. And he'd clearly been briefed that when he gets in, he's going to be approached by British intelligence and everything else. And there was a British military intelligence officer sitting beside him. So he wouldn't talk to me for the first few weeks. And we then ended up being best friends. But we've been training the Ukrainians. And they didn't just go to the British Staff College. They went to the US Staff College, the French Staff College, and were trained across NATO. They could bring both sets of tactics together and understand how they could best use their Soviet-style equipment, but with what they were getting in from the West, and they could understand the enemy. And understanding your enemy and understanding your enemy's weakness gave them a real strength. They had a flexibility in the Ukrainian approach.
Was that potentially a weakness as well? Because you'll remember the Bakhmut fight, 30,000 casualties, the Wagner group piling convicts in there.
Yeah.
And it felt like a grinding war of attrition that Russia would inevitably prevail. Yeah. And I remember listening to some of my military colleagues, particularly some US colleagues, saying, "Oh, for God's sake, Ukraine mustn't get themselves dragged into these sort of trophy fights."
We've talked about this beforehand. I think Bakhmut was actually one of the most successful operations that the Ukrainians could have executed. And I do that because if you look at when it happened, that was whenever the Western floodgates had started to open with Western equipment and everything else. One of the most difficult things to do for any military is to restructure, re-equip with different equipment, redesign your doctrine, your tactics and everything else whilst you're fighting a war, whilst you're in contact with the enemy. And to do that, you have to create a bit of space. So what Bakhmut did was, I think, it focused the Russians because psychologically they wanted to get it no matter what. But it allowed the Ukrainians to fix the Russians in that area and, yes, withdraw slowly. But, they did it. They kept it going for 15 months, I think it was, in the end. Something along that. But if the Ukrainians hadn't been doing anything during that 15 months, I'd agree completely. It was a waste. The Ukrainians had been fixed and nothing else. But during that 15 months, they took big chunks of their frontline troops, rotated them out. So those were the combat experience. Sent them off to the west to be trained in how to drive Challenger 2 tanks and fight infantry, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and learn to use M109 howitzers and everything else, and create new formations. And people don't realize the real change in dynamics that you get in organizations that are fighting. The old Russian type tank has got a crew of 3. The Western tanks have a crew of 4. You're changing the dynamics completely in a single platform, and that changes the psychology of how you're going to work and fight within units that may have a lot of experience, and that takes time. And the Ukrainians use that time of the Russians getting fixed in Bakhmut to take a lot of their military capability away, to be trained, to be re-equipped and everything else, and then bring it back in again. They were hoping that as soon as they brought it back in again, then they could launch the counteroffensive, and that would be a success and all that stuff. But they launched a counteroffensive, and it didn't achieve what they were hoping from a tactical perspective on the front line.
The spring offensive was a fascinating one. I don't think we've got necessary time to cover it today. One of the things I am interested to get your take, though, is that we have the benefit of now looking back through the lens of history.
Yeah.
And at the start of the conflict, NATO, the West, was very reluctant to get involved. Ukraine's not a member of NATO, the risk of escalation. Then we provided NLAWs, we provided some anti-tank weapons, and there was lots of sucking of teeth.
Yeah.
Then Ukraine said, look, we need to have weapons to mount the counteroffensive. We need tanks, modern tanks. Lots of teeth sucking. Eventually, the West provided tanks. Then they talked about long-range missiles. Now we're talking about TACMs. And with the benefit of hindsight, if we'd done that at the start, would that have actually changed the game? And the second part of the question is, given that that's the gradual movement, do you think there's a time approaching when Western forces will go on the ground, or no-fly zones will start to be imposed?
There's a lot in that. If we'd given, and here's where I'm going to be different to a lot of the commentators and people in Ukraine, if we'd given them all of that capability up front, would that have helped them? No. In fact, I think it would have put Ukraine in a worse position, and they would probably have be handing territory over to the Russians today. And the reason why I say that is they weren't in a position from a training perspective and from a military perspective to be able to learn how to operate and fight the equipment. That takes a lot of time. They had to stabilize what Putin's strategic objectives were, so stop them taking Kyiv, push them back to a point where they could fix them, and then create that space and trade space for time to allow them to do that. And it's exceptionally complex, and the numbers of bits of equipment, and it's not just those that are operating it and fighting it, it's all the support teams and everything else that goes in there, and the logistic networks that need to get set up. What the Ukrainians have achieved in that first 12 months, I don't think the British military or the US military could have done in 2 years. It takes, in a normal training cycle, and this isn't where you're under pressure of war, but a normal training cycle to take a British brigade where you've got your infantry battalions and you've got your armoured battalions and you've got your artillery and you've got your engineers, and put them through a cycle where they are certified as being able to operate together, is a 2-year cycle. Ukrainians were doing it in less than 6 months. And it's exceptionally complex. And therefore, I think the West had to allow them to have time to prove militarily that they could hold the Russians, that was important politically as well, because if we'd given them lots of Western equipment, all of a sudden Ukraine had collapsed and a lot of Western equipment fallen into Russian hands, then it wouldn't have looked good for Western governments, and Western governments would have fallen. The other thing is, if we'd given all the equipment up front and said, "Here, you've got it, therefore fight it," if they'd lost it, they wouldn't have known how to fight it. So they'd have lost it to the Russians very quickly indeed. And that would have had massive political ramifications back into Europe and going, "Oh, well, you don't know how to use it, so we're not going to continue to support you. You're negotiating, you'll give the Russians what they want, and we'll negotiate a settlement." I think the pressure came from those European countries and NATO countries that would have been then tight up against, a little Russia. And we've got the Baltic states, and we've got Poland, etc., turning around going, "Hang on, we'd be next. Stop. We have to stop this." And there will be a lot of political pressure in the background from them through their friends. And this is where the UK came in, because we have got alliances with a lot of the Baltic countries and up into the north that are outside NATO but complement what's going on. But we had the political clout pre-Brexit and then post-Brexit, and because of our position in NATO, to go to the other countries and go, "Look, come on, we really need to do something. And by the way, we're going to take the lead, and therefore we're going to give them 12 tanks." There's only 12 tanks. But it unlocked the political door, and that's where it came in. A very, very complex and very difficult time.
I'm not suggesting there's another, an alternative explanation, but if I can just string a number of improbable things together to see how much sense it makes. So I think, I'm not a military guy like you two, but in business, it takes time to wind up a company.
Yeah.
Because you've got so many different parts. If they're not working together, it's a complete failure.
Yeah.
So I understand that. But let's assume that in understanding that process of time, some people in the West might be, at the beginning, might say to themselves, actually, it's in our interest for this to take time, because time means depletion of Russian forces. Because we can help Ukraine be smart. We can top and tail a convoy and take them all out.
Yeah.
That's being smart, and you don't have to fire many bullets or shells or whatever. So Cameron, a couple of weeks ago, whether we misspoke or not, I'm not sure, said the war was actually quite convenient for us because we've depleted the Russian forces and it's been cheap. We've not lost a single soldier.
Yep.
Meanwhile, I don't know what the number is, but I heard the other day 500,000 Ukrainians dead.
Yep.
That's a lot of people to give the West a chance to basically grind Putin away to the point where, he's lost 3,000 or more of his main modern battle tanks, and he's had to go, as you said, back into the museum and so on. So there is another sort of scenario. Now, so, you could say it's a bit sort of tin hat, but, being a slight cynic of these things, they wouldn't put it past some people to be thinking about...
I wouldn't say it's tin hat in any way, shape or form. I think, and there's a lot of senior generals in the United States and other countries in Europe have turned around and come up with a similar theory. I've seen it quoted, for less than 15% of the US defence budget, we have destroyed 60% of our number one enemy in the globe. Who's benefiting out of this? The US defence industries and therefore US taxpayer and all the rest of it. The other bit, and I'd add to that from the business perspective, Russia was a huge arms exporter around the world. If people didn't buy Western kit, they bought Russian kit, and therefore they generated an awful lot of money for Russia. Now that the kit has been shown to be so bad, that market has disappeared completely. Who's going to benefit from it? Well, two areas. The West is going to benefit a lot, and we're seeing that. The Chinese are sitting up and suddenly going, "Oh, actually, we can fill that niche with countries that don't want to do business with the West." So I think there is a possibility of a business element to it. Do I think that was has been a direct contributor to why the war has gone the way it is? No, because I don't think there's the level of sophistication to be able to plan that in Western countries. And I've been a planner for operations at this sort of level, worked in through NATO, worked in through EU, worked with the United States, and sat down, and that level of thinking just doesn't come into it.
So how's this all going to end? Because at one end there's a grinding war.
Yep.
There's a lot of turbulence in the elections at the moment in the European countries and the US. Only the last couple of days, there's been reports that President Trump's been listening to a plan, which has not been run past Zelensky at all. Is Western patience running out? Is there a deal to be done? Do you sense that however abhorrent a deal might be to Zelensky, that actually it might just be that the West is lining up to impose something on him?
I think there's a number of elements to this. The political landscape is changing, and we don't know how it's going to change until we see the outcome from the US presidential elections. Donald Trump's a businessman. He approaches things from a business perspective. And this is why when he was president, the 45th president of the United States, we saw him turn around and say, you don't pay, we don't play, effectively, when he was saying to NATO countries, if you don't pay your 2% contribution, then we're not going to guarantee the United States is going to come and support you. Everyone went, oh, that's terrible. What are we going to do about that? If you look at what's happened in most countries about that, they're now spending close to 2% or 2% of the GDP. So, from a business perspective, he used a businessman's approach to getting people to do things. He's in the run-up to him potentially being elected. He may not be. He's scaring Europe and scaring the rest of the world as well. So what are the rest of the world doing? What's Europe doing? We're buying more military capability to be able to work more independently from the United States. Hey, that's good for Donald Trump, because it means that other countries are standing up and we're not always relying on the United States. And if it gets into a shooting war, United States service personnel having to get involved. So it's within his business brain to turn around and use these blunt threats and everything else. Who's going to decide what the conditions are for negotiation? Warfare is diplomacy by other means. The only thing that's going to finish it is sitting around a table and negotiating. But you have to have the conditions set for that negotiation to start. And the conditions from a Zelensky perspective, if the Russians had come in and bloodlessly taken up to the edge of the Dnieper River, a big chunk of eastern Ukraine and all the rest of it, then Zelensky wouldn't be under as much pressure as having lost 500,000 people. The psychology amongst the Ukrainian people is we don't negotiate until we've kicked them out. And the precedence that it would set if there was negotiations to give Moscow any part of Ukraine that wasn't that was part of the internationally recognized boundaries of Ukraine, would set a precedence around the world that would be exceptionally dangerous, because we're 2.5 years into this. Donald Trump comes in, so we'll be 3 years in February. If in February he turns around and says, negotiate, and you're giving Crimea and you're giving part of eastern Ukraine, then the message that sends to Xi Jinping in China is that, okay, if I forcibly take Taiwan and bring it back under, I only need to be in a position to ride out international condemnation for 3 years, and then we can negotiate. And I'm economically more powerful than Russia, and therefore I can probably bring that down to 2 years in negotiation. Is it worth me doing that? And how would that work? And he would probably say, yeah, let's go for it.
But you're arguing from a logic perspective.
Yes.
You're arguing from a long-term perspective.
Yes.
Most of our politicians don't think long-term.
Yeah.
And my worry here is that somebody like Trump, you said he's more of a businessman. There's a deal to be done, and I'm the man to do it. The fact that deal would unravel several years hence or be seen as a bad deal, that wouldn't be on his watch.
Yeah. It wouldn't be. And this is where there's multiple layers of deals that go on in here. One thing that gobsmacks me that isn't coming out in the press is, and it is one of the abhorrent sides of warfare, there's lots of money to be made in it. And if you look at where the $60 billion aid package that the United States is giving to Zelensky, they haven't written a check going, there's a check, Vladimir Zelensky, for $60 billion, away you go and start spending it. It's spent in the United States. So in all of the different states and everything else where members of the Senate and elsewhere have their power bases, have got industrial and defence industrial sites and military bases there, they're all benefiting. They're benefiting because their production lines are growing. They're having to employ more people. That's creating supply industries and supporting industries out of there. There's better ways of life. People can afford better housing. It's stimulating local economies. They're paying state taxes and they're paying federal taxes, and therefore it's stimulating the state's ability to do stuff, and it's stimulating the federal reserves and everything else, because we're spending lots of money on the war machine.
It's better than that, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because now he's in $60 billion debt, well, actually plus. So how's he going to pay the debt back?
Yeah.
Well, he can pay part of it back by giving away the resources you talked about earlier.
Yes.
So the West sort of wins in every single way.
Well, and the third area that West wins, which is we're said to you, is the Russians supplied an awful lot of kit out to different countries around the world because they were massive defence exporters. Their equipment's been shown to be so poor. The Americans already, you look at what their industries are developing. They're developing, lighter, less expensive aircraft, tanks, other capabilities ready for the market. There's already Western equipment being transferred into Indian control, and there's a lot going into different areas which was traditionally they'd buy the stuff from the Russians because they see the Russian stuff is just so bad. And therefore there's a big opportunity there from a long-term perspective. So I think when Donald Trump gets in and puts his business hat on, he's going to go, if I bring this to an abrupt end, not only could I make the world more unstable, hey, that could be good because it's going to bring more money in for a defence industrial base. So he might look at that. But if I cut the money and stop doing it, then the people are going to be screaming to me saying, why am I now unemployed? Why am I this? Why am I that? Are those who are manning the production lines in the United States who'll suddenly find that those production lines are cut and they're then unemployed? He's going to be a very unpopular president if he does that. I don't think he'll do that from a business perspective. And again, Europe's beginning to wake up to that in some areas. And this is where those countries that have a strong defence industrial base, and the UK's not playing on this. And I just don't understand it in the general election because it has a strong defence industrial base. It could ramp it up. Germany sees it, and Germany's going quietly in the background, and the French are going, hey, there's lots of euros to be made out of this, and the French are always very good at it.
And what politicians say before an election is often quite different from what they actually do afterwards.
Yeah.
So Trump's big, your big blunt words of Trump before, because I think he said the other day to Putin, if you don't start negotiating and reach a settlement, I'm just going to wipe you out.
Yeah.
And he's saying to Zelensky, if you don't reach a settlement, I'm just going to cut your money and it's all going to be over. But it might be quite different afterwards, particularly if he thinks, as you said, actually any negotiation that based on that threats is actually short term.
Yeah. If he forced them into a position where, and here's what I'm going to hypothesize, the Russians withdrew from mainland Ukraine, and there was an agreed deal that Crimea was demilitarized, and there was a level of international control over Crimea, where Russia and Ukraine were represented in it. That could be something that could be sold to both sides. And maybe that's the sort of thing that's in the back of Trump's mind, where he could come up with a compromise that would be acceptable, because it's not letting Russia retain territory, but it's not letting Russia lose complete face. So Putin could turn around and say to the Russian people, we didn't want the Ukrainians to have our jewel in the crown, Crimea, back. That it isn't happening anymore. It's under international control, which is, as an international player, as a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, we're very content with. And of course, it's going to be overseen by the Chinese or something else.
I think the danger of these conversations, though, is that, bluntly, negotiations only happen when one side has effectively won, or both sides have ground themselves to a stalemate.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's potential benefit for both sides into talking.
Yeah.
At the moment,
we're nowhere near that.
We don't seem to be anywhere close to that. And therefore, unless a solution was imposed on the two sides, and I still struggle to see.
But again, how do you impose a solution on both sides? Because the Ukrainians are in a position, even if they lost US support, I don't think they'll lose European support, because you'll find that there's coalitions of European countries would suddenly
on our doorstep, isn't it?
And would keep giving Ukraine enough to keep plugging away. Zelensky is a lot younger than Putin. Putin is in a lot less stable position politically and all the rest of it. So it's relying on his business networks, his criminal networks. And he's just replaced most of the senior ministers across his government with people who are more loyal to him or members of his wider family. You go back in history again, we analyse that. Whenever dictators do that sort of thing, they tend to be really concerned about their position. And if Putin disappeared, it's very difficult to work out. There's no natural successor. Very difficult to work out how that would affect what Russia's doing and everything else. And there is no natural successor where we can turn around and say, well, that individual's policies are this and therefore would like to go down that path, or that individual's policies are that and go down that path. Those that are his immediate advisors that are sitting in there who could step in are almost more extreme than him. So we're at that horns of a dilemma, and there does not seem to be a clear path that are going to bring those two horns together to a point where you can find a bridge to go between them.
But that for me, it feels like we were originally focused on the military action. Some of the meetings I've been to more recently are talking about political and economic as being the other two legs, that if you make it untenable economically for Russia in the long term, then traditionally the real power lies with the oligarchs, the senior generals, stuff like that. Eventually they go, hang on, I can't go on holiday anymore, I can't, I'm indicted by the criminal court, and eventually there's a short, sharp shock as Russia resets itself, whatever that looks like. And the question is therefore, it feels like the West is sort of pivoting a little bit to that long game, but I
agree with you, and I think the West is pulling all of the different levers. We'll have to remember, the first levers the West pulled against Russia after its reinvasion were economic ones, sanctions, heavy sanctions. That's what probably stopped Xi Jinping from executing a plan to go and take Taiwan, because he thought, the West's going to be focused up there, I can take Taiwan, and there's not a problem. When he saw the economic sanctions, he'd have gone, we're not in a position to be able to ride this out, put the plans back on the shelf and we'll leave that for a few years. And then the military aspects have come in, and now it's time to go back to the economic sanctions. I think one of the things that will be worrying the West enormously at the moment, and that ties in with one of the things that you said, we think in prime ministerial or presidential or short periods of time. Putin is thinking in multi-generational times. And he's forming greater alliances with Xi Jinping, who's doing that, with the Grand Ayatollah in Iran, with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. And then you look at a lot of the BRICS countries that they're part of. So you've got Brazil, India, South Africa, Russia and China.
And 30 other countries.
Yeah, that wanting to join into it and forming that economic power bloc. The West is suddenly going, actually, we're now in a really difficult position politically and economically, as well as a difficult position militarily. And I think our governments are trying to pull different levers, but not enough to stimulate an overreaction.
But this tags quite nicely onto my last area on this, was because I think sometimes we end up confusing economic with military. So, for example, the European Union is quite a good economic bloc, and actually BRICS seems to be more focused on economics, another way of marriage of convenience from financially. When you look at NATO, which is a military alliance, one of the things that Putin will be feeling is a degree of isolation. Indicted by and some of his efforts, as you talked about how do you create an alter ego to NATO, an axis of evil, Schmersh or whatever it is. But it does feel as if that seems to be what he's trying to do. But actually, in a way, I don't think China would want to join that, because it would force it to take sides, which it's been very effective at not doing so far. What's your take on?
It's interesting. I think Putin is pushing very hard to do that. I think Kim Jong-un clearly wants to be part of it. I think the Grand Ayatollah and Iran want it for different motivational reasons. Kim Jong-un, because it will allow currency to come into his country, allow him to start to bring a bit of prosperity back into his people. Get this relationship with what was a superpower, and it's brilliant. It's good for him. Iran wants it because I think Iran is sitting there going, okay, it's going to get to the point where I can negotiate a nuclear warhead and advanced nuclear technology. So that's their motivation in giving a level of support. China has got a completely different view, and they're going, well, what is it? What's in it for us? Because it's all what's in it for us. And what's in it for China is access to Russian natural resources and I would say there's probably ownership of Russian natural resources. A beta testing ground for Chinese military equipment, because China has been on a program of professionalizing its military and re-equipping it with more modern equipment and everything else. But the one thing that China has never been able to do is to combat test anything that it's got. It's now got a combat test ground for what's going on. It can sit there and use that and turn it on or turn it off as another leverage of influencing what's going on with its relationships with the West and elsewhere, and use that to mask some of the stuff that it's doing in the South China Seas with the Philippines, with Taiwan and everything else that's there. And you use it as a political barometer as to how people are thinking China could react to that. So China's looking at things from, how can I benefit from this economically? Iran's looking at it from, how can I get stronger militarily from a regional perspective? North Korea is going, hey, this is great. Oh, right, we've got money and everything else. The plausibly deniable little bad boy that's sitting there. And Russia is just going, I hope we can get all this together. This is an alliance.
And that's the point, is that it doesn't feel like one size fits all. I think the economic is definitely gaining traction. It's quite difficult to see how the military would work.
I call it a marriage of convenience at the moment, but it's one where there's a lot of tensions, and the outside observers will be going, this isn't a marriage that's going to last.
Fragile.
Very fragile.
Yeah. One thought for the future.
Yes.
We talk about currency. North Korea getting currency in. Big question is, which currency?
Well, yeah.
Because there's a lot of feeling at the moment, fear that the dollar's going to come under attack.
Yeah.
And therefore won't be the international currency. Or there's an attempt from the East to downplay the dollar and create something else, some other, formula. So
if we look at what a lot's going on, and this ties in with Russia's continuing interest into Central Africa and elsewhere. I think China, I read in the Financial Times or something recently that China is buying more gold than any other country in the world. Russia is mining and supplying gold and precious stones and everything else. So currency, I don't think it's necessarily going to be anchored to a single fiat currency. It's being anchored to something that has got a value because of how precious it is. And then what we're seeing is a growth in digital currencies. So and how that's going to impact it. Now, the Chinese version of digital currencies with a digital yuan that they're trying to bring in will give them much greater control over all business in and out of China, and control of companies that are doing business in and out of China. But it's going to be underpinned by the Chinese central bank. If that's underpinned by gold or some other standard, then there's less volatility in it. They don't want to get into the likes of Bitcoin. Those that are decentralized cryptocurrencies, but there's still the Russians are using that to trade a lot around the world. North Korea uses it continuously to trade around the world and everything else, and to do business. And therefore, I think this is another complicating factor that is going to come in. It doesn't suit them very well at the moment,
though, does it? I mean, as you say, the two examples you cite there, North Korea is just struggling for any form of
for anything,
and Russia, because of the various sanctions that have been put on it, predominantly around oil and stuff like that, it's been going. So the world is still consuming the same amount of oil. It's still produced it. It's just that now China can go to Russia and go, we'll have a bit of a discount on this oil.
Exactly. And China is a massive consumer of natural resources. That drives everything. That drives them economically. And if it can get access to cheap natural resources, it then means that China can keep its economy growing in that it's doing, and it's under some difficulty, but keep supplying cheap goods out to the West, because its manufacturing costs are going to be kept artificially lower because they're getting the natural resources that they need at a lower price. But it's a house of cards across the board, and any one little thing could trigger that house of cards to collapse. And my concern is the collapse of that house of cards would see not just a European conflict, but the potential for there to be several regional conflicts that could then join together.